Welcome to Saturday morning. I'd like to start off with a couple of schedule change announcements. We had 2 sessions this afternoon canceled, so all the sessions for the rest of the afternoon have been moved up to fill that gap. Renderific with Kevin Savitz starts at 1:15.
Oh, shit.
Is that a problem? No. Okay. And the vendor hall on swap meet starts at 2 o'clock, and prizes are awarded at 4 o'clock, and we'll be able to leave here a bit earlier for dinner to hopefully beat some of the crowds. But right now we have a panel on crowdfunding your 8-bit dream, led by Ken Gagne.
Thank you. Yay! No. Good morning, and thank you for coming to Saturday morning of KansasFest 2019. Yeah! Are we ready to have some crowd fun? Ding. Yeah. So this panel is about funding the 8-bit dream, which is all about using Kickstarter and Patreon for your retro computing projects. Who here has ever backed a Kickstarter project? I think almost all of you. How many of you have ever run a Kickstarter? Wow. Well, fine. How many of you have ever backed somebody on Patreon? Again, most of you, okay. And how many of you have ever run a Patreon? Okay, cool. So I won't go into the basics of how crowdfunding work with Kickstarter and Patreon. You all know that Kickstarter is an all or nothing, and it's a one-time shot, whereas Patreon is an ongoing small donations for ongoing projects, which are usually already available for free, and you're just trying to level up with some additional funds. So I won't explain all that, because you already know that. But I have 4 panelists up here who all have experience with Kickstarter or Patreon or both. We're going to be talking to them today about their experiences, their accomplishments, what lessons they've learned, and what they hope to do in the future. We're going to start by getting out of my slides entirely. Okay. Is the camera pan wide enough to pick up that? Because that was a late change. Can you check that, Mike? Thank you.
Yeah, please check the camera angle. If you don't get the slides, it's mostly just introductions to these folks. Can you fit us and the slide in? Then I would prefer you focus on the people. So thank you. Good call, Kevin. So funding the 8-bit dream. We're going to start at the end of the line here with Mr. Mark Lemmert of 6502 Workshop. Mark, you have run 2 Kickstarters. The first one was a couple of years ago for Nox Archaeist, your 8-bit RPG, and unfortunately you didn't meet your goal. There's a screenshot up there. You were aiming for about $40,000 and got about halfway there, courtesy 172 backers. And then just a few months ago, you did round 2, and you blew away your goal. You lowered your goal and got about twice that much. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Yay. So... And I'll be asking you more about these experiences to come. Seated immediately next to you is Mr. Chris Torrance. Hello, Chris.
Hello.
How are you this morning?
I am excellent. Thank you very much, Ken.
Thank you for being here. So you have a Patreon which supports your video podcast series on YouTube called Assembly Lines. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And you also have an online shirt store, and you do a lot of other things, including be on the KansasFest committee, but this is exclusively for your video podcast series, Assembly Lines. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct.
Do you also run ads on your YouTube videos?
I do not. That's partly my decision, but also it's YouTube's decision because I don't have enough subscribers. Hint, hint, if you're not subscribed.
Please like and subscribe. Good to know. Thank you. Next to you is Kevin Savitz. Hello, Kevin.
Good morning, Ken.
You have a couple of Patreons, one for your media publishing empire, but the one we're talking about today is for your scanning and interviewing. Is that correct?
That is accurate.
Because you were doing the Ted Nelson scanning project. Was
Right.
that part of this Patreon?
No, that was separate. The Ted Nelson project was a very expensive project that we did funding for separately, requested donations for that, which I tried not to touch that money for anything else.
Got it. So this Patreon is exclusively for your Antic interview series.
Yes, and other scanning that I do for archive that's not Ted Nelson.
Got it. Okay, thank you. And next to you is Mr. Charles Mangan. Good morning, Charles.
Good morning, Ken.
You have a Patreon for your, whoops, I skipped it, for your how-to video series. And you are also one of the early adopters of Kickstarter. You did a Kickstarter for your pressure pen, which is an early pressure-sensitive input device for iOS devices. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And unfortunately, the first Kickstarter did not succeed, but similar to Nox Arceus, you regrouped, launched a second one, and you succeeded. Congratulations.
Well, thank you.
And that product, did it become a manufactured product where people could pre-order it, or was this something you were open sourcing?
It's open source, and actually just recently I've gotten some interest from someone who wants to take the intellectual property, such as it is, and create a new product based on it.
Really? Congratulations.
That's just been in the last week or two.
Because this pressure pen project was on Kickstarter 7 years ago.
Yes, you did say an early adopter, and that's correct.
So iOS has changed a lot. The Apple Pencil was not a thing back then, but there's still a place in the market for products like the pressure pen?
I think partly because it would work with any iOS device, but also any Android device. Whether it has a digitizer for the Apple Pencil or for something similar or not, it's entirely sound based. So as long as it has a microphone, it would work.
Very cool. I like it. And that was actually my introduction to you, was the pressure pen. Before you ever came to KansasFest, you were somebody I interviewed for an article I wrote for Computer World magazine about crowdfunding. So that was my introduction. Hello, Charles. Nice to finally see you at K-Fest.
Yeah.
And then there's me. I have actually never run a Kickstarter or a Patreon, but you might say I have a crowdfunding problem. I have backed 465 Kickstarters. 385 of them were successful. So, and the very first Kickstarter I ever backed was the Jason Scott sabbatical on November 22nd of 2009. So this coming fall will make a decade of me throwing money at Kickstarter. I have a similar problem with Patreon. Rather than find one artist I like and give them a lot of money, I back a lot of artists for a little bit. So I'm currently backing about 50 different artists for $1 each. And that cycles in and out. As I decide I've given you enough, I swap to somebody else. So I've probably backed like 120 different artists on Patreon over the last 5 or 6 years. I teach crowdfunding techniques at schools and libraries in the Boston area about how to launch your project, what makes effective marketing techniques, etc., which I have gleaned not from my own experience, but just from backing hundreds of Kickstarters and also interviewing a lot of people who have done projects like this. So today we're going to be talking about how specifically to use these money-generating outlets to back or to support your retro computing projects. Now, all of you have been doing the things you were doing for a while. Nox Arceus was already in development before you went on Kickstarter. Assembly Lines was a thing. So was your podcast. And Charles, your how-to video series existed before you went on Patreon. How did each of you know when the time was right to start asking for money for these things? Because one of the key principles of crowdfunding is that it should not be the first place that somebody hears of you. You shouldn't go and say, I've just launched a podcast and I'm asking for your money. You should already have a reputation that people are aware of you and your product before you start asking for something in return. So when did you make that leap, and how did you know the time was right? Who wants to jump in?
I can jump in, and the shortest answer is to how did we know when? The answer is we didn't. In looking for comparables, other Kickstarters and crowdfunding campaigns for Apple II, games, let alone role-playing games, we could find none. So the approach that we used in lack of having that kind of information was, to Ken's point, not let Kickstarter be the first place people heard about us. We started first by going out on forums and releasing YouTube videos and trying to raise awareness in other ways. I came to KansasFest for the first time in 2017 on the heels of having done a series of YouTube videos showing progress on the game, gave a presentation here at KansasFest that year, and announced the launch of the Kickstarter, which we then followed up with several other announcements over the coming months, and then led into the Kickstarter, thinking that wave of awareness would help us going into the campaign launch itself.
One of the two things that you need to have going into a Kickstarter, as I mentioned, one is reputation. The other is a prototype. You need to be able to show that you're actually working on the thing you're asking for money for, and that it can become a full-fledged product. So this could be the first chapter of a book, the first level of a game, a teaser trailer for a documentary, etc. And you certainly had that with Nox Arceus. It may not have been playable, but you had a teaser trailer that you could show this thing is in development.
Exactly.
This is in sharp contrast to David Crane, who created the Atari 2600 game Pitfall. A few years ago, he went on Kickstarter and said, hey, I know it's been 30 years, but all these other people like Al Lowe, etc., they're all coming back on Kickstarter to make new games. I want to make a new game. I made Pitfall 30 years ago. Give me money, I'll make a new game. And all I have to show for it right now is this single frame of an artist's rendition of a temple in a jungle. And that was it. No animation, no playable level, no video, just a single drawing. And he wanted $800,000 to turn that into a game. And even though he's David frickin' Crane and he made Pitfall, he only raised like $19,000 because there was no prototype there. So that's something that you had, Mark. What about you, Chris, with assembly lines?
Yeah, I guess I would say there's probably no right time to actually launch anything, either a Patreon or a Kickstarter. I mean, obviously there could be wrong times, like you don't want to launch your Kickstarter on, the week of Christmas break or something like that. But just in general, like at least for my Patreon, it was more almost an experiment where I certainly wasn't looking to make money off of it and be able to retire. It was really just a way to kind of explore the platform. I knew other people had done Patreons and seen, that, you could get something for it. And I think the biggest hurdle for me was just to get over the, asking people for money, because that was just kind of a weird thing to do. But really, I can't remember where I saw it, but the advice was, don't worry about that. If people like what you're doing, they'll support you, and if they don't, then they won't. And so it's not like you're going out and begging people for money or something. And so just kind of reading that helped me to relax a little bit about it. And it was also just, as far as the timing goes, it was more just an experiment to just get it out there, see what happens. If it grows, it grows. If not, then it's no big deal. And I'm certainly not going to retire off it. I think I have 24 backers right now on Patreon, which is great, and I love that. But for me, it's just a hobby, and it's just a way to, if people want to leave comments and get kind of the inside scoop, that's great. So as far as when to launch yours, if you're thinking about it, I would say just, if you already have a product out there, like Ken said, that's the key, is have something that people already know you a little bit. I would say just go for it. There's no right time or wrong time. I would just put it together and put it out there, and you're definitely going to make mistakes along the way, but just keep doing it.
I also did it kind of as an experiment. It seemed like it might be fun to try that platform. For my Patreon, some people, I had done hundreds of interviews, and many people were just like, how can I help? And so I sort of did it just to allow people to give an easy way to feel like they were helping me, and they would be helping me for the time and money I put in for the interviews. I feel I don't like selling. I didn't want to feel like, this is a hobby, and I didn't want to feel like I was muddying the waters with just like, and you can give me money for doing my hobby. So I don't think I jumped in with with both feet to it. I just put it out there as a thing you can do. And at the end of the interviews, I changed a little bumper, and instead of, if you like these interviews, give money to archive.org at archive.org/donate, which you should all do. I changed it to, if you want to help, you can give money to archive.org, or you can donate, give it my Patreon. So it wasn't exactly a hard sell. It's just like, give money to this nonprofit, or me, And people did donate and did contribute to the Patreon. And that was fine, and I appreciate that. And yet, despite my hard sell, and this is just me being stupid in my own head, when I see that people are donating or contributing, $120, $150 a month total, and I'm just like, I'm doing great work. Why am I not getting, $1,000 a month? Well, A, because I didn't want to sell it too hard, and B, this is a hobby, and so I contradict myself.
And Charles?
As far as the the Kickstarters that I ran, and it's been a while, so the model has changed slightly as far as what is required before you can even launch one. When I did my first one, it was sort of shoot for the moon. If I get the funding, then I'll do the project, and that's kind of the wrong way to approach it. With the second one, I had been working on it on my own and with the help of a couple of other designers to do the production on the 3D case and everything. And so for the second one, I was determined to make at least one of these things to work and have, a working thing at the end. And so the Kickstarter was more, I'm going to make this whether people help me with it or not, so I might as well ask for help. And in that case, I was asking for considerably less, but I was also more successful. So the advice that I would give is, if you're going to do it anyway, and it would be nice to have the funding to make 1,000 of your gadget versus 5 or 10 that you make in your garage, then that's the attitude to have, rather than if I get this money, then I'll make the thing. It should be the other way around. I'm going to make this thing whether or not I get the money, and if people want to contribute to it and they're interested in this thing, then that's a bonus on top. And also, you won't max out your credit cards.
That's most of what I've seen. I've backed about 80 Kickstarters that have failed, and usually the final email I get from them is saying, hey, our Kickstarter failed, but we're going to keep working on this thing, and we'll be back. It might take longer, and it'll be a smaller product, but it'll still exist. So to your point, Charles. I'm interested in knowing what your goal was with the money you're going to receive, and that's a different question based on whether you're using Kickstarter or Patreon. But for example, with Chris and Kevin, I'm curious to know, was this money you were going to be using to reward yourself? Were you going to be using this to offset expenses? Were you going to be using this to level up your equipment and reinvest in the show? And for Kickstarter, I'm also curious to know, what were your expenses? I mean, it's possible to make a game for the Apple II without asking for $40,000. So I'm interested to know where that money, what your intention was in running this Kickstarter as well. Why don't we start with Kevin?
For me, it was definitely to offset expenses. Doing the interviews, I pay for a number of services, including Skype and research tools like newspapers.com and whitepages.com, tools that are essential for doing research to finding people and researching the history. So that was basically it for me.
Yeah, and I'd say the same for me. It was really just, actually it was probably to pay for the products that I'm reviewing, so all of the, it's probably all getting funneled to Henry Corbus actually at Ultimate Micro, or Plowman. And things like, buying better lights for, my basement room so I can actually look halfway decent. But it was just kind of incidental expenses, stuff like that.
And what about Mark and or Charles? Let's start with Mark.
Well, for Noxer Chaos, it was all about the physical rewards. To Ken's point, it doesn't take $40,000 to make an Apple II game digitally, but to get the box, the cloth map, the manual, the artifacts, and all those things in there, that's where a lot of expense, of course, comes about. And our commitment was always, we're making the game, we're making Noxer Chaos no matter what. It will be available digitally no matter what. The Kickstarter was strictly to raise funds for the physical boxed collector's edition.
So that's referring to the production and distribution of the final product. Is that to say that you have no development expenses?
Well, strictly speaking, no. But I'll comment on this a little bit, because one of the what others have commented from time to time, interesting things about the way Noxer Chaos evolved is that we have a team of 11 people. Quinn Dunkey commented on Open Apple once that that's more people than are working on many of the mobile games at the commercial gaming company where she works or worked at that time.
So and this will tie back to the point, Ken, but basically the way that evolved was lots of people would like to make a game. Some of them have the skills to make a game, but then you also have to have the time to make a game, and very few people have all three of those things. I have all three of those things. Others in the community, I found a lot of people that had the ability and the desire and maybe a little bit of time, but not enough time to really do the project, but liked the idea of participating in one. And was able to offer that opportunity through KansasFest and, for people to contribute as they had time in different sorts of ways. And the way it ties back to the financial side of it and Ken's question about development expenses is fundamentally, all of us in 6502 Workshop are doing this for the fun. We wouldn't be doing it otherwise. There's certainly none of us are going to, get rich from this. At the same time, being that I'm actually not a professional programmer, please don't, cancel your pledges. I'm a finance management and business management professional by career, and I always think about, okay, well, what are the different things that can happen? We designed this basically not to make money, but to get the game out into the hands of as many people as that we could. But at the same time, I wanted to prepare for the possibility that, well, who knows? Maybe a little bit of money will be made. Maybe there'll be some money left over. Whatever. So what I did in recruiting the team of 11 is basically set up profit sharing agreements. So fundamentally, nobody's getting paid. Therefore, to your question, Ken, development expenses are technically zero. If there happens to be money left over, as a team, we've got a mechanism for distributing that so that we'll all still be friends at the end of the day.
Because there have been Kickstarters for games where people say, we want to quit our day jobs and work on this game full time, so the
Yes.
money that we're raising is not necessarily development expenses or production expenses, it's cost of living expenses.
Right. Absolutely. And that's one of the big risk points that I hear talked about in the community. There's a growing fear of funding games on indie games on Kickstarters. And to some extent justified, to some extent perhaps it's being taken too far, but that's a lot to do with the reason is there's been a number of indie projects that have approached it, as like they were looking for funding to pay themselves while doing the project, and then that creates all kinds of problems with underestimating what the expenses are going to be inclusive of, basically, so the game's late, and all of a sudden, well, you need living expenses for that much longer, and there's been a number of high-profile projects that basically just, didn't work out as a result of that, and that was something we tried to convey as much as we could with KansasFest, is that nobody's income depends on this project. The game is going to happen even if this doesn't fund. This is about the box edition to try to, build confidence around that.
Okay. And moving on to the next question, I want to know, how do you incentivize people to give you money? Because Kickstarter and Patreon both offer rewards where you can say, you'll get a physical product at the end of this, or I'll remove the ads from my website, or etc. So is the thing that you're making enough, or do you need to further incentivize them to give you money? Anybody? Let's start with Chris, and then Kevin.
Oh, great. Is that because I had the grimace on my face? So, truth to be told, I don't really incentivize. I'm actually really bad at it. So if you go to my Patreon, it says, hey, support my Patreon. If you support me, you'll be the first to hear about the videos, blah, 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 insider scoop. Sometimes you'll be the first if I remember to do the Patreon first and hit the button, but usually it's like you'll find out 10 minutes before somebody else, so I hope that doesn't dissuade anybody from backing me, but it's really, I think if I were doing this kind of professionally or something like that, I would obviously want to have a more structured form of incentivizing people. But for me, it's really, I'm just hoping people like it enough that they're willing to, chip in something without expecting a lot in return. So hopefully that it seems to be, fine at the level that I'm, getting.
Okay. And Kevin, how do you...
If you want to properly incentivize people, it takes work. And I'm not willing to do that work. But really, you can do tiers, and you go, give us whatever, $50 a month, and you get a secret private newsletter, you get free early access or the beta or whatever it is. And just having that infrastructure takes effort. And you're already doing the work on the work, and now you have to basically work to service customers now. Now you're doing customer support, and you've added another layer. And potentially what was a hobby of I'm putting out the software, I'm doing interviews, or I'm scanning stuff, has turned into a hobby plus a little bit of job, because you feel obligated to give something that you promised people who are giving you money. I don't like that. That's part of the deal, frankly, but I don't like that part of the deal. I do nothing. My tiers are just like, you can give me this much and thumbs up, and you give me this much and 2 thumbs up, but and then once a year, basically in January, I send a little newsletter item out saying, like, summarizing what I did last year. I interviewed X people, and I scanned all these interesting things and whatever. If people really care about it, then they need to follow me on Twitter, and they need to check my Internet Archive upload history every once in a while. If they don't, they might feel they're not getting any value for their support of my Patreon. And I'm putting the stuff out there, I'm doing the work, but man, I don't want that extra layer. So.
And I can say, as somebody who has never run a campaign but does back a lot of them, I sometimes feel a little cheated when I don't get something from my pledge. I know there was one game developer who I was contributing to every month, and she never sent a single update. There were no rewards. It was just a one-way street where I gave her money, and that was it. Black hole. Yeah, and I assume that the money was being put toward the purpose that she expressed. I don't think the money was mismanaged. But at the same time, I felt like she should have been obligated to give us something. And so after about 5-10 months of that, I canceled my pledge. Now, maybe that was disingenuous of me. Maybe I didn't believe in her cause enough to give her money without me getting something out of it. Maybe that was selfish of me. I give to you, Kevin. Actually, full disclosure, I give to everybody on this panel. And
That's why we're here.
This is my reward. So, give me this much money a month, and I'll come to your KansasFest panel. But Kevin, I like your annual email. And I also, I know the money I give you is being put to good use, and I actually got a Juiced.GS article out of one of those annual emails because it inspired me to write something. So, thank you. Charles.
Oh, okay.
How do you incentivize people to give you money, either on Kickstarter with Pressure Pen or on Patreon with How To?
Really, with How To, it's not particularly active. If you haven't noticed, I haven't posted one in quite a while. And part of the reason why I started on Patreon to begin with was to gauge the interest of people in those videos. And there wasn't no one was beating down my door to give me money to make more videos. And if there were, then there would be more of them, and there would be more rewards. Like if I'm building something or making something, maybe you could get one. But as it is with Patreon, the only real reward that someone gets for backing me on Patreon is maybe early access to the next video that I get, because I post it on there before it goes to YouTube and before I put it on archive.org for public consumption. If it were to take off, then I might get T-shirts printed up, and you get a T-shirt if you back at this level, that kind of thing. But then it becomes, like Kevin said, a job and an obligation, and it has to reach a certain level before I could do that. And it's kind of a chicken and egg problem where, if there's no reward, no one's going to give you anything. But if nobody puts in, and if there's no interest, then I'm not going to make any rewards. And as for the Kickstarter, the rewards were things like, getting one of the product at the end, or getting a product with the extra replacement tips, or just getting thanks on the website, or getting a signature edition, that kind of thing. So the reward really was the thing itself. as opposed to something above and beyond what I was making.
Because that's one of the things about Patreon. As I said, it's important to have a reputation, and that usually means you're already doing the thing that you're asking for money for, and you're usually doing it for free. So they can get your videos without dropping a dime on it. So you're saying the reward is the video, and that's the donation on Patreon is their way of saying thanks for the thing that you're already making.
In my case, essentially, yeah.
Okay. I'm curious to know how much work it takes to maintain these crowdfunding campaigns, or in the case of Kickstarter, to run it for that 1 month. I have heard that is as much as a full-time job to run a Kickstarter. I have interviewed several people who have done Kickstarters, and they say that they have no social life for the month that Kickstarter is running, and they do as much work as possible to have everything written beforehand. Like when they hit the $10,000 out of the $20,000 they're trying to raise, they already have the blog post written and the animated GIF of them jumping up and down and dancing, so that when they hit the goal, all they need to do is publish, as opposed to scrambling to say, oh, we now need to celebrate that we made it this far, and adds that much more labor into that very compressed time frame. So, Mark, you have run 2 Kickstarters. One of them ended just 2 months ago. How much work was that? Not just preparing for it, but the actual execution.
Sure, and I can speak to it from the standpoint of running a campaign that didn't fund and running one that did, as to how much work it was. And what I found is that in both scenarios, it was a lot of work. If the campaign doesn't fund, you're going to be scrambling, trying to do things to get it to fund. If it does fund, or is on a trajectory to fund, just the reality of that success is going to create work in a variety of other ways. So, if you kind of go through there is no like Kickstarter manual, but if you do your research on a Kickstarter and kind of identify, here's the things that you need to do, it will seem like, oh, well, I can get this all done in advance and hit the start button, and I need to respond to some emails here and there, but I should be on autopilot. And I found that, and I think Chris would agree, that is just not the case. We were actually on the second campaign up at 2 o'clock in the morning on the first day, basically brainstorming to add a couple additional high-end tiers, because the first day went so well that it had entirely sold out. And I suppose one could argue that, well, we could have made it not a lot of work by just simply saying, okay, everything's sold out, we're done, and I guess it still would have succeeded, and but that was inconsistent with our mission. We wanted to give everybody the opportunity to to get the extra special rewards, so we wanted to create some more and some things like that. So I guess with that in mind, I also want to say that if the time commitment seems too onerous, you may not want to let that stop you. I mean, it's theoretically possible to run a campaign and really trim down on the amount of time. You just have to be prepared to focus on what's absolutely critical. Be prepared that there's going to be a lot of things that you want to do that aren't going to get done, a lot of things that people are telling you that you should do that you're not going to be able, you may not be able to respond, to lots of people. I mean, I think it could be done on a more minimal, time commitment. It's just, would require really adjusting expectations on that.
And Chris, I'm sorry, Charles, you want to jump in on that?
I was going to say, if you're thinking about doing something like Kickstarter, you're putting yourself out there into the public, and you're going to get a lot of ridiculous questions and ridiculous suggestions. So be prepared for, I'm going to say weirdos, but weirdos to come out of the woodwork, because you're basically selling them an idea that you have, you've raised like a child, and now you're putting it out into the world, and some of them are not going to like your child, or they're going to think that you're dumb, or that it's dumb and it's bad and you should feel bad. But don't be discouraged, because really they say that to like really successful and really well polished things too. It's not just you.
And I think there's going to be good suggestions and less good suggestions that come in that category too.
Oh yeah, you're going to get.
You know.
You're gonna, if you have a good idea, you're going to have people that want to help you.
Right.
And they're going to want to do more than just give you a credit card. They're going to want to help out
Right.
in some way. Like, how can I promote this? How can I, put this on my own blog and that kind of thing. But yeah, the ones that really stand out are the weirdos.
And that's where I think the time intensity comes from. A lot of it is sifting through that. You're getting all these suggestions. What are the good ones? What are the bad ones? That takes a lot of time. So if you want to really run a bare bones time commitment campaign, you have to be prepared to basically not engage with suggestions like at all. You just, sorry, can't. That was my last comment. Sorry.
Chris.
Yeah, no, that's fine. So I helped quite a bit with the Nox Arceus second campaign. And I guess I would say, it sounds scary, right, to listen to all this, like, oh, it's going to take a ton of time. But I think one of the keys is also just the upfront preparation. Mark and I and the rest of the team did a ton of work up front. Behind the scenes to make sure that the Kickstarter was going to be successful. We did a lot of research, either looking at other Kickstarters or there's a great series of blog entries by Stonemeyer Games. What's the guy's first name? You remember?
I don't.
Yeah.
But
Anyway,
StonemeyerGames.com.
There's he's got about 100 blog posts on how to run a Kickstarter, and they're fantastic. So we read all of them. It's really the upfront preparation that I would say, devote a lot of time to that. And then as far as actually like during the campaign, it's really like a lot of unexpected things that might come up, and hopefully nothing, too disastrous. But, like Mark said, okay, what do we do if you're actually really successful? We had a question about we hadn't really thought too much about stretch goals ahead of time. I mean, we had a couple, but we weren't prepared for the level of success. And so that was something where we just had to do a little bit of scrambling to get that down. And it's really, just be prepared for it to take a fair amount of time. I don't think it necessarily has to be a full-time job, but it is a significant amount of time.
So with each of you having run a Kickstarter or a Patreon, I would like to know, what is one mistake each of you made that you wish you had done differently?
Me.
You are the mistake?
I set up my Patreon. I set up the Patreon for my interviews and stuff in March 2017, and I've watched it during that time. I get the little reports from Patreon, like, oh, you made $100 a month, you made $130, and I think I told you before this talk, in preparation for this talk, that I didn't feel like it was nice, and I appreciate it, but it's not really affecting my life. It's not, paying some bills, and it's not really changing anything for me. Well, so I logged into Patreon this morning in order to get some stats for this talk, and I saw that I had never linked the Patreon to my bank account, so they had never actually transferred me any money, and they owe me $2,400. So that might be nice once I actually get a little bit of money.
That might move the needle a little bit. Pay some bills.
Yeah, so my mistake I made was not fully setting up the account when I set up the account.
Lesson learned. Charles.
I'd say being too ambitious at the start can kill you, especially with an all or nothing campaign like Kickstarter. And there are other crowdfunding platforms than Kickstarter for different kinds of projects and different funding approaches. So some of them are all or nothing. Some of them are, you get what you get, and there's no real downside to not making your goal, other than you didn't make your goal. You still get what people pledge to you. But being too ambitious and sort of overstepping your bounds and not realizing that what you're doing is essentially signing up for a full-time job. Not signing on friends and family first would be a mistake that I made.
Should or you shouldn't?
Oh, you should. Yes, you should definitely sign on your friends and family and tell them what you're doing, because they're going to be there if you get right to your goal and there's just one day left and you're not going to make it. Get them to push you over the finish line. Whether it's just with moral support or with personal loans, getting you over that finish line. But also, tell them what you're doing. Don't do it in a vacuum. Your mom or your grandma might not understand a lot about this retro hobby that you have, but tell them and say I'm trying to get money, and if you want to share it with your here's a link if you want to share what your kids are doing, or if your cousin happens to be in an industry and they might have office mates that are interested in it. Just use your personal network before you try using the social network, and augment that. Even if you don't like talking to your friends and family about money, it's a good source, a good resource for you. And I didn't do that at the beginning, but once I had done the first one, I was talking about it and saying, yeah, well, I may not do this project again. I may not do it anymore. And they're like, oh, what was that thing you were doing? Oh, well, let me tell you about it. Oh, well, I would have helped you out. Oh, well, okay, now I'll know that for the next time.
The most heartbreaking experience I have ever seen on Kickstarter was a project I backed. A company in Boulder, Colorado, back in 2012, was trying to make a modern version of Mule, that classic computer game. They were asking for $80,000. Kickstarter is all or nothing. They fell short by $20. They raised $79,980, and they got nothing. And I can't help but wonder, who else could they have asked? So,
Here's one other little thing. If you do a Kickstarter and you get the funding, you better friggin' deliver. There's a couple of times when I had Kickstarted a thing and they got their money and then they didn't deliver the product. And this is years ago, and it might have only been $100 or something that I lost, but it still pisses me off when I think about it. And they're never, angry, and will I ever trust this company again? Absolutely not. So, everyone has high hopes, but man, if you get that Kickstarter, that sweet Kickstarter money, you better put out the product that you promised.
well, two responses to that. One is Kickstarter is not a store, but also when I give a workshop on how to run a Kickstarter, I always tell them if somebody asks for a refund, give it to them. Because paying them back that $20 is more valuable than dealing with them complaining at you for years. There was one company that I backed their Kickstarter. It took them 5 years to put out the product. And every time they issued an update telling them about the status of the project, there was this one guy complaining, where's my money? Where's my money? I want a refund. I don't want the product anymore. I want my money back. And they had to deal with those comments for 5 years before they finally shipped the product. I was like, why not pay the guy to shut up and have him go away? That would be better for your mental health. Chris and Mark, briefly, one mistake you've made.
Yeah, just real quick. So I would say, if you're doing a Patreon, think carefully about how you actually structure the way you're getting the money. So there's kind of two different ways you can do it on Patreon. You can either do like a per item, per video, per blog post, whatever, or you can do it monthly. And the difference is, it depends on whether you're doing it like for a hobby or for a living. And I think one of the mistakes that I had originally made is I tried to do monthly, but the problem with that is then you're really expected to get something out every month because the people are paying you no matter what. And so that was bad for me, because then it was kind of like putting pressure on me to get something. Maybe I didn't have to anything to do that month for a video. And so I would say just think carefully about how you're structuring your campaign or your Patreon. In my case now, I'm just doing it per video, and sometimes if it's just like a personal video, like I'm launching my T-shirt store, I don't charge my Patreon people for that, because that's just weird. So think about how you should structure it, and whether you want to do it for a hobby or whether you want to ask people for like a monthly donation.
It's interesting. I attended a Patreon panel at GamerX a few years ago, and I asked them, do you recommend per product per creation or per monthly? And they all said monthly, because it's the only way to make sustainable, predictable income. So So there are arguments for both. Yep.
Not sustainable or predictable.
No argument here. Mark, one mistake you made.
Definitely setting the funding goal too high in the first campaign. We set the funding goal at roughly $40,000 and raised roughly $20,000. The second campaign, we set the goal at $8,500 and we raised $40,000. I think we were within like 10 or 20 bucks of the goal of the first campaign. There were definitely other factors involved that led to the level of success that we had in the second campaign. However, I'm absolutely confident that having the lower funding goal helped. People get a lot more excited about a project when they see first that you're closing in on that funding goal, and then that you've passed that funding goal, especially if it happens quickly. I mean, the amount of buzz that was generated throughout retro space when we hit the funding goal in the first 2 hours was just phenomenal. And that just wouldn't have happened even if the same dollars had come in the first day. If the funding goal was still, distantly off, that excitement just wouldn't have been there. And that's tricky to do, to financially engineer things such that you get the goal low and you're not putting yourself in a situation where you don't collect enough to actually do what you're promising. Nobody said this was easy, but it is a mistake that I think that I made, setting that goal substantially too high, and that's what I wanted to share.
Thank you. I know we're at time, but I'd like to ask one more question of the panel. Is it okay if we run a little long? Thank you. I do a lot of things that I derive no revenue or income from. I write a weekly Apple II blog post. I host 2 podcasts, Polygamer and Transporter Lock. I edit Juice.js, and most of my YouTube videos don't make any money. Should I launch a Patreon to sustain these activities, and why or why not? So let's start with Mark and go down the line.
My instinct is yes, because I haven't run a Patreon, but from what I've seen, Patreons are fairly successful for content sites that are for sites that are producing content on a regular basis and that have an audience, and yours do. So I think you would have similar results to others where people are contributing to the Patreon essentially, and this was described earlier in the panel, where basically they are rewarding you for what you're already doing. So I would see no reason why you wouldn't be as successful at that as others.
All right. Chris?
Yeah, I would completely agree with that. I would say if you have an idea and you're already creating content or something, it's easy to set up a Patreon. And as Kevin and I think both showed, it's also easy to run them if you don't do very much. And it's just letting people who are already like you and already appreciate what you're doing just support you in another way.
Kevin?
I'm going to say no. I'll be the contrarian here because I think Juice.js is hopefully already profitable for you on its own. The other things, you have a full plate of things that hopefully you're doing because you love them, the podcasts, and don't pile on with something that you have to do, because I know you and you're going to feel obligated to over-deliver to your Patreon subscribers. And if you could use that time to put out another Polygamer podcast or just go for a bike ride, and that's way more fun than supporting Patreon people. So keep your hobbies.
Which one of the many things that you do would you want to do as a Patreon? Or would it just be the Ken Gagne project?
Well, that's a good question, because it would be confusing to lump a weekly Apple II blog post with a monthly podcast about diversity in the game industry into one Patreon. So if I had to choose one, I would probably go with, let's say, my diversity podcast.
Okay. In that case, then I would say yes. The blog posts are something that you do, you're going to do anyway, and they have a niche audience, and the podcast is something that has a niche audience as well, and you have a co-host, and you have people that you interview, and you have probably more expenses for that, for equipment and things like that. So it'd be nice to have the occasional way to offset some of those costs. Writing for the blog or doing some of the other things don't have much of an overhead, and if you're if you're trying to find a way to incentivize that particular thing, it would be difficult unless you know exclusive access to the archive or something like that would be kind of ridiculous.
Although now that I've said that, I might need to rethink which product I would try to monetize, because I've been accused of trying to profit as a straight white cis man off diversity in gaming. So maybe I don't want to make money off that podcast. Maybe it should be something else, but that's a different topic. We have time for maybe one question from the audience. Does anybody have a question? Back there, Olivier.
The Kickstarter creators, so when you're involved with projects, does Kickstarter offer advice and abilities as you go through the campaign? You get whether you're on target or behind target, and yes, how does that align with reality, and how is that helpful also?
So I think the question is, as you progress through the Kickstarter and you have your own goals and you have analytics about whether or not you're meeting those goals, how does that affect what you're doing while you're running the Kickstarter? Oh, I'm sorry. Were the predictions accurate? For example, there's a website called KickTrack, KickTraq, where you can punch in a Kickstarter URL, whether or not it's yours. It'll give a prediction of, are they going to meet their goal? And have you found analytics that you were given as a Kickstarter creator to be helpful and or accurate?
Well, Kickstarter itself has a large online set of articles and things that are helpful to creators. They don't like reach out to you and really one-on-one work with you on anything. Maybe they do for like the big $1 million campaigns or things, but not for most. And as far as analytics, what they will send automated periodic emails to you that tell you basically, here's how much funding you've raised, here's what your goal is, here's how many backers you have. You can also see that in a portal. So I don't know that the emails are necessarily all that helpful. I'm looking at the portal all the time. But there's a third-party site called KickTraq that does actually give projections based on, well, here's where you are today. It gathers that data from Kickstarter, and then it'll actually make a projection on where your end funding is likely to be. And as to its accuracy, I would say, it's kind of interesting to look at, but I wouldn't say that it's necessarily terribly accurate either. But I would recommend it for anybody that runs a Kickstarter campaign to use KickTraq. It's also a very useful way to see. This is its most useful thing, is actually how many pledges do you get in a day and how many pledged dollars did you get in a day. Kickstarter itself doesn't really have a very good way to see that, whereas this third-party site KickTraq does, and that's probably the most useful thing I've found on the analytics side.
Cool. So we are a bit over time, so I want to thank all of you for coming, and also my panelists, those being Mark Lemmert, Chris Torrance, Kevin Savitz, and Charles Mangan. I also want to mention that there is more diversity of people who are using crowdfunding for retro computing than might be seen on this panel, and I regret that those voices were not heard today and that they were not at KansasFest, but I do hope that you will find those creators and these creators and back their projects. So thank you.
Thank you, Ken.
Thank you.